While landings are being secured on the Normandy beachhead, fighter planes roam Europe, knocking out railroads and highways, harassing enemy motor transport, tanks and troop concentrations, and chewing up German communications. Gun sight aiming point cameras record the precision of our fighter pilots on June 6th. German air opposition is extremely light, and our losses very small, considering the great number of aircraft involved.
Hi, I'm Bernard Kempinski. In this video, I will discuss the design and construction of the Trainbusters diorama. I had thought about this project for several years. I was inspired by the role that the P-47 and other aircraft played in supporting the ground attacks in Europe by interdicting German transportation. In 2023, I proposed the Trainbuster diorama to the Tailgate Modelers, a group of modelers that live in Virginia and Florida. My initial concept for the project was to set it in Italy during Operation Strangle, the Allied campaign to interdict the Italian peninsula in 1944. The diorama would use forced perspective with 1/72nd airplanes in the foreground, HO trains in the midground, and 1/144th scale airplanes in the background. The first step in the project was to accumulate the various models that we would need. My brother Rob Kempinski, who lives in Florida and is a big Grumman fan, built the Academy 1/72nd scale P-47 and painted it in Italian campaign colors. Then he built a Tamiya bubble top as a backup. Meanwhile, Jack Keane, who also lives in Florida, built two Minicraft 1/114 scale P-47s. However, we only used one of them in the diorama because there wasn't room for two. Dan Pierce is the third team member from Florida. In addition to being a model builder, he also does model trains. He offered to build a Revell 187 scale locomotive. While he did a nice job on it, we decided the model really didn't have the detail we wanted for this diorama. So we switched to making the trains in 1/72nd scale, and that required that Dan build another kit, in this case the Hobby Boss Kriegslok BR52. While that locomotive is nicely detailed, we had the other problem that there are no true 1/72nd scale trains available as kits, so I had to 3D print the bodies and chassis. I also had to draw true 1/72nd scale wheels to print. I also had to draw custom decals, and they were printed in Canada. While the guys in Florida were building the individual models, I built the box for the Shadow Box diorama. At this point, the project took an unexpected turn. We learned that the theme for the IPMS convention in Madison was D-Day. So we reoriented the project from Italy to somewhere in France and Germany to reflect the United Air Force Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo. That was their campaign to interdict German rail and truck traffic to isolate the D-Day battlefields. I liked the photo of this bridge, and so I used it as a loose inspiration for the prototype of the bridge that we would model. My initial concept was to use foam as the interior of the bridge and laser cut an applique for the brick surface outside. However, I wasn't happy with the way that turned out, and so I ended up cutting the core out of 1/8 inch plywood and applying a resin impregnated laser engraved texture sheets on the outside. I had to hand lay the track to true 1/72 scale. To create the terrain forms, I used styrene foam and I filled in the gaps with lightweight spackle. With the basic terrain shaped, I gave the ground a base coat of paint and then started laying out the models to get a feel for how they were going to look. In this version of the diorama, we did not plan to use mountains and tunnels, so we decided to employ trees as view blocks to hide where the tracks touched the backdrop. We made the trees using super tree material from Scenic Express and leaf flocking material. I was lucky in that my brother and my niece Jennifer were visiting for a week and they volunteered to help make some of the trees. With tree construction underway, I proceeded to apply the first layers of base scenery to the model. I also began to paint the backdrop. The idea in painting the backdrop is to paint the model onto the backdrop, not necessarily try to make a photorealistic scene. We decided that the composition of the scene would be improved if the whole train was moved a little bit to the left, and we had added a gondola with an anti-aircraft gun behind the locomotive. So this meant that one of the freight cars had to be cut in half to make room for everything. This ended up being very effective. You can't really tell that it's just half a railroad car at the end of the train. In this view, you can also get a better look at the hand-laid track with the individual spikes. With some of the trees installed, I began to embellish the groundwork. In this view, you can see that I've painted in a dirt road. I also painted in the muddy banks for the creek. Because the airplane models are delicate, I used the Italian campaign P-47 as a stand-in while we were doing construction. I will later replace it with the appropriate Invasion Stripe P-47 that Rob built. There was no model of a 1/72 scale gondola available, so again I 3D printed one from a file I got online. To add the cannon, I used an Orange Models 20mm flak Fearling gun. I had an older kit, but the Orange Models was much nicer, particularly with the optional brass barrels. And so I installed these on the gondola, and then I embellished the interior with ammo crates and wood siding and panels. Now it turns out that the Germans, when they put flak cannons on these trains, they would leave the one behind the locomotive unmanned. They would only man the one on the end of the train. I suppose it's because the smoke from the locomotive would make that gun ineffective. However, they needed one on each end of the train in case the train reversed. You'll notice now that the model has come together that I have installed the final airplanes into the scene. You can also see in this photo some of the scenery materials that embellish the scene. I used static grass, sill for flowers, deadfall from twigs that I collected, and smaller sprigs of super trees to make bushes. To create the water surface, I used a new product for me, ultraviolet cured resin. I applied a thin layer onto the painted stream bed and then used an ultraviolet light to harden it. But I also took the model outside for about a half hour just to make sure that the ultraviolet from the sun would cure the material. Last but not least, we have Mark Franke, who is the last team member of the Tailgate Modelers. Mark lives in Virginia. He volunteered to build a IBG Models 917T German truck that I had purchased along with some figures. It was a very challenging kit and it took him quite a while to build it. But the idea is this truck is being hit by the airstrike and the crew members are fleeing. I used a tea candle with some black painted polyfiber to create the fire and smoke effect. I also used my knife to put a bullet hole in the window. The final details were to add blurred propellers to the airplanes. I made these on my laser cutter. and to put a third airplane in the background, simulating the fact that these planes are doing an orbit and are continually strafing this target. I used cotton polyfiber with some gray paint to simulate the exhaust of the engine. I also drilled 2 holes in the boiler and have jets of steam coming out to simulate bullet holes. I hope you enjoyed this look at how we did our group build. Despite being in different states, we were able to get it all done, and it was a lot of fun.